Good evening. How are we this evening? I'm great. I usually like to believe that I'm just a person that runs on Facebook, a person that just comes around, says a few things, just to get people riled up to talk. But there is a video that I made about 2 weeks ago on this very same platform about South Africa and its economy and its need for transformation. And what is interesting is that somebody shared that video on their wall. And after sharing that video on their wall, that video got 400 shares or plus. And on this platform, it had about 133 shares. But on the wall where it had 400 shares, the gentleman that controls that wall came back to me and said to me that Facebook had removed the post. And he wanted to know where he could get another link to put on his post. Now, I'm saying that not to say that I'm relevant, but I'm saying that to say that some of what we speak about on this platform has got certain people who are powerful enough to take it down that are not happy with the message. And that is why the message is critical. It's important because it is a message that can bring change. So today I'm talking about a situation of a people that are in a war that they don't even know exists. Now I want you to take a look at our continent as a human body. And the reason I'm giving this metaphor is that there are a lot of people that keep asking me, what is your obsession about talking about South Africa, yet you're a Zimbabwean? And I always say to people that our continent is a body. And on this body are critical body parts that constitute the countries of the continent. In the brain, once upon a time, in the head, the brain of the continent, in my perspective, was a country called Libya. And the heart was a country called South Africa. The lungs were a country called Nigeria. And the kidneys were a country called Ghana. And as part of the glands that were producing the antibodies to fight bacteria was a little country called Zimbabwe. This little country was able to send its army into a country called Mozambique to help with the liberation of Mozambique from sabotage that was happening because of elements that were being funded by the South African apartheid government to cause destabilization in the region. Zimbabwe was instrumental in getting independence and getting freedom in Mozambique. Then there was Congo, Zimbabwe again. When Kabila came into power, the people that put him into power, the rebels that put him into power, that were being controlled by Uganda and Rwanda, wanted to overthrow Kabila because he would not give strategic posts, strategic military and government posts to foreigners, to the people that had helped him to get into power. They wanted to overthrow him. But it is said that they were also being funded and financed by a bigger power that was behind them. The United States, the Europeans. Zimbabwe was able to put its forces in there, defend Kabila and ensure that he was not thrown off. And as this gland was doing its work, somebody decided that it's time to stop this gland from working. In 2000, the very first sanctions on Zimbabwe were put because of its participation in the war in Congo. Reasons were given. Indiscretions that were done by Zimbabwean soldiers were given as reasons why Zimbabwe needed to be put under sanctions. But ever since Zimbabwe was put under sanctions, there has been free reign in the region with destabilization because Zimbabwe is now thrombosed, sabotaged economically. Now, what I'm trying to say to you here is that all that is part and parcel of the war taking place on the body of Africa. And some of these wars that have taken place on the body of Africa have been induced and instigated and sometimes supported by African leaders. So the brain that I told you about, Libya, it was sabotaged by two leading countries on the continent, the heart and the lungs. The South African government and the Nigerian government took a decision together with the Europeans to allow a resolution for Libya to be attacked. And when Libya was attacked, the brain of the continent was disrupted. I'm not going to go into the detail to explain why Libya was the brain. But now what is interesting and fascinating today is that the heart, South Africa, is under attack. And South Africa is at war. And the people, the citizens in South Africa have no clue that a war is taking place. Particularly the black citizens of South Africa, the black business people, the black middle class, the black poor, the black peasants have no idea that a war is taking place, and it is a war that they are losing. Now, how do I know that there's a war that is taking place in South Africa? Why am I so convinced that there is a war that is taking place in South Africa? Well, there are a number of factors that make me say that South Africa is at war. The activities of war are taking place in South Africa. What are these activities of war? I see planning. I see propaganda. I see economic sabotage. I see biological warfare. I see arms race. I see militarization. I see infiltration of the masses of South Africa by enemy forces. And I see the turning of friendly forces into enemy forces. All those are the hallmarks of what you would call a war. If you read The Art of War, it basically has the same structure of what constitutes a war. On the planning front, a lot of people forget that the apartheid government, the apartheid system was never dismantled. The brains, the minds, the hearts, and the institutions that constituted the apartheid government still live and exist peacefully in South Africa. And if you understand that the apartheid government was run by an organization called the Broederbond, you would understand that the Broederbond still exists till today and is still in operation. With more than 2,000 cells, the Broederbond is still meeting, having meetings, coordinating strategies, and designing the war room and running the war room of the war that is taking place in South Africa. And what is more important and much more critical is that the apartheid government has even become stronger, more powerful than it ever was before when it was in power. Why? Because right now it's not under sanctions. Right now it does not have a humongous budget to deal with the masses and the publics. It just receives funds to fund itself without the responsibility of taking care of citizens of a nation. The organizations that constitute the Broederbond, the organizations that constituted, the private organizations that constituted the apartheid government are in existence and flourishing today. NASPAS. Today, NASPAS is worth a 1 trillion rand in market valuation. That's a Broederbond organization. ABSA, Nedbank, Old Mutual, Sanlam, all these institutions are flourishing in the new South Africa, but without the responsibility of taking care of the public. So this juggernaut, this monster of the apartheid government is flourishing undercover. And you would then look at the aspect that there was an announcement that was made by a group called Solidarity, and Solidarity is a trade union for white workers. And they announced last week that they have just raised 3 billion rand for the security of Afrikaner nationalism in South Africa. Now, this 3 billion rand will be to secure Afrikaner nationalism and Afrikaner culture using organizations such as FARC. That is another Broederbond organization, an affiliate that looks at maintaining the culture of Afrikaner nationalism and culture. This is an announcement. This is an announcement at a time where a nation is at war, so someone would say that it is a propaganda announcement. And then you would come from there and understand that while we don't know that war is taking place, while the black citizens don't know that they're at war, while even their ministers are not aware that they're at war, while they're busy partying and drinking on a Saturday night, while they're busy dancing and having sex on a Saturday night, the Broederbond are meeting. Their structures are meeting. Meetings are happening in farms. Meetings are happening on vineyards. Meetings are happening in business premises. And there are discussions and plans and war room talk that is taking place as they strategize and plan what their next move is. So what are these moves that are being discussed and planned in this war room by people like the Broederbond? They're talking about propaganda. So right now in South Africa, we've got this new buzzword, which is state capture. And this thing called state capture, there's a group of people called the Guptas that are responsible for the state capture in South Africa. Bunch of Indians who want to take over the running of South Africa. But what is ironic about this state capture is that it is state capture in a country in which 60% to 70% of the economy is controlled by whites. It is also state capture that they talk about in a country in which the ex-finance minister, who was a government employee, now works for the Rothschild as the chairman of South Africa Rothschild. It has to be ironic. It is a country in which the Reserve Bank is not controlled by the government, but it is controlled by private shareholders. Private shareholders who in most cases are secret. We know that the big four banks, which are white controlled, are part and parcel of that Reserve Bank, but we're not too sure of who the other shareholders are. But we talk about state capture that is instituted by people like the Guptas. We talk about state capture, yet for the past 21 years, it is well documented that leading white businessmen were responsible in advising people like Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, on the policies and the people that they should choose to put in certain institutions. But that wasn't state capture. State capture starts today with the Guptas. For me, that is propaganda at work. But where the propaganda gets interesting is that the BBC itself took time to create an entire documentary talking about state capture in a small little country called South Africa. The BBC was so interested, a government-sponsored media company was so interested in the state capture in South Africa that they even created a program that talked about a British company that was created by Sir Bell, a knighted gentleman, knighted by the Queen, of course, whose company Bell Pottinger got involved in trying to salvage the relationship or the perception and identity of these Guptas. They made the mistake of supporting the Guptas and trying to run a PR campaign. Obviously, somebody didn't give them the memo from the UK that they were not supposed to defend the state capturers of South Africa. But what is interesting is that the BBC ran such an aggressive campaign to the extent that Bell Pottinger itself pulled out. Not only is BBC active, but also the South African media that is owned majority by Broederbond companies also was unrelenting on these Guptas until Bell Pottinger had to withdraw. Just last week, after the BBC program, 4 executives had to resign from Bell Pottinger. Bell Pottinger had to apologize that their activity or their engagement with the Guptas was ill-advised, and that they had created a notion of white monopoly capital in order to cause division in South Africa. So basically the narrative is Bell Pottinger is saying there is nothing called white monopoly capital in South Africa. Now, if you're a person that reads history and understands history, you will understand that propaganda particularly propaganda that involves Western media, has always been a hallmark in South Africa during or before a great war. The one time that the British media was totally and very interested in the South African situation and propagating propaganda was just before the Anglo-Boer War and during the Anglo-Boer War. This is something that makes me say, we are at war now. There is a war taking place now. Another thing that makes me know that we're at war is economic sabotage. We have got a situation today where the economy of South Africa is in recession. While the rest of the world is growing, South Africa is in recession. But we are told that South African white corporates are holding anything between 300 billion and 400 billion rand that they're not putting into the economy in order to slow it down and put pressure for change in government. But not only is that happening, you will also see that in the government putting more pressure for there to be black empowerment in South Africa, white companies have come up with the policies that determine which companies can become suppliers and which companies can be brought in to give services to these white companies, and that should include black companies at least giving 25% of the services. But a lot of the policies that are put in by these white companies in the private sector, but also these very same white companies become the consultancies that write the policies for empowerment and choosing service providers even in government, are very prohibitive. Prohibitive in such a manner that they do not allow any small companies to participate in providing services to white companies or government because of the onerous requirements. They will ask you to be certified by maybe ISO 2001. They'll ask you to have Standards Association certification. They will ask you in some cases to have a security, a safety procedure certification. All these are requirements that cost a whole lot of money and requirements that even small white companies do not have. But ironically, small white companies continue to get the work. You will also see that the economic sabotage goes to the extent of the policies that have been created by this private institution called the Reserve Bank of South Africa about how black people, or the requirements for setting up a financial institution or a commercial bank in South Africa. As a gentleman came on the business show and he was saying, literally in South Africa, it is impossible for any black person or any grouping of black executives to ever meet up with the requirements of creating a black bank, that it's almost impossible for any black people to come together and create an independent commercial bank in South Africa. The laws have been made so prohibitive that we cannot have a black bank in South Africa because of the regulations that have been made by a private institution that is controlled by white companies. Economic sabotage. Economic sabotage also comes together with the next point, which is biological warfare. In South Africa, we've got a situation where the seeds of this country for the staple foods are controlled by United States companies. Companies like Monsanto, Swiss companies like Syngenta, and companies like Bayer, which is now a partner of Monsanto, have bought all the seed companies that were in South Africa, and they've made sure that they have instituted their genetically modified foods in the region. Now, if you understand that genetically modified foods were created in the 1960s as a Harvard Business School strategy to penetrate Africa, India through the Green Revolution and make them subservient or captive markets of American genetically modified foods. Genetically modified foods are known to cross-pollinate and destroy organic seeds of a nation, destroying the nation's seed store, and at the same time contaminating those organic plants to make them genetically modified plants, which now gives ownership of those organic crops that have been contaminated to the genetic modified company owner. So big US biochemical companies and agro businesses are monopolizing Africa monopolizing South Africa's seed and South Africa's food supply to the extent that all staple foods are genetically modified. Your mielie meal, genetically modified. Flour, genetically modified. Soya beans, genetically modified. All these also constitute the feed for animals, and they're controlled by Western companies and partners that are white in South Africa. That, for me, is economic sabotage and biological warfare, because there is a lot of discussion and debate that these genetically modified foods also have consequences on the health. They also have effects on the health because of the pesticides that are in them, because of the BT that is found inside these seeds that is able to fight pesticides because of inbuilt that is able to fight pests because of inbuilt pesticides that are found in the plant. Then we come from there, we go to an arms race. As I speak to you right now, South Africa is having record levels of application for firearms. And these applications for firearms are done in police stations that still have white apartheid officers running those departments. They determine which applications succeed to get a firearm. And in such a case, the majority of people that are getting firearms are white people. And black people in general are not given firearms for obvious reasons. Number one, most black people have got economic difficulties. They are not doing well economically, so they cannot afford to have a safe in the house. They cannot afford to have a house that is properly secured in order for it to meet the requirements for the owner to be given a firearm. Whereas most white people are financially emancipated. They are the ones that continue to keep their jobs even when retrenchments are happening and black people are losing their jobs, so they can have a safe, they've got proper houses, and they've got houses in which the owner can secure the premises to be able to keep a firearm. So you've got a situation in which 1/4 of the population, a certain quarter of the population, can arm themselves for self-defense, while another quarter of the population do not have the resources and do not get given permits for firearms even when they meet the requirements because of their race and because of their circumstances. That for me is an arms race, but an arms race that is tilted unfairly. And this goes to my next point of making, saying, because we are in a war in which one side of the warring parties doesn't understand that it's in a war, but then the other side of the warring parties is clear that they're in a war and they're fighting an enemy that they need to defeat. In this arms race, you also see a situation in which we have a proliferation of security companies that are owned by white owners. These security companies have got armed guards that outnumber the police and the military of the South African government at the present moment. Now, if you go back to the point that I made earlier, that the apartheid government still exists today. The same apartheid government that was doing arms deals with the West, with the Americans, with the Israelis, with the French, still exists. And during the time that South Africa was supposedly under sanctions, this very same apartheid government carried out secret deals for arms deals with the West. They received ammunition from the West. They received high-tech military equipment, including nuclear technology, from the West secretly, while the world thought that South Africa was under sanctions. Now, you need to understand that they would have never gotten nuclear technology without being put under the same restrictions that North Korea and Iran are under, if it wasn't sanctioned by the West. And this, the apartheid government, was able to become the strongest government in Africa militarily because of co-option and cooperation from the West. Now, the question that you need to ask yourself is that if this government still exists, if this government has more money than any time that it ever had in the past, and if this government is undercover today, are we sure that the West is no longer conducting secret military dealings, secret arms deals with this subversive apartheid government that is apparently at war in South Africa? And then you will then go and see that we have this arms race taking place in a situation of militarization. What is this militarization I'm talking about? I've already given you some of the points. White people in general get firearms much more than black people in South Africa. White people in general, and Westerners in particular, own the security companies that are in South Africa. 83% ownership of the security industry in South Africa. 53% of the ownership of the security industry in South Africa is in foreign white hands. And they have a bigger force of firearms and armed people than the police and the army put together in South Africa. But that doesn't end there. While you and me are partying, while you and me are busy enjoying the benefits of South Africa, the credit and the houses that we live in and the perceived success, there are training sessions that are taking place on farms. Right now at night, while you and me are watching entertainment, watching the useless programming that have been put on a NASPA's owned DSTV, there are people on farms practicing long-distance shooting, practicing how to use night scopes, night goggles. They've got drones that are using night vision cameras. They're practicing military strategy. Military experts, ex-special forces from the South African Rekis, ex-special forces from the Israeli Syriat Medical, and even ex-special forces from the United States and the SAS in Britain are in South Africa. They are in South Africa like visitors, people doing business, but at nighttime, they are there training people on these farms how to utilize firearms, on military strategy, military technique. There are people practicing while the blacks are getting drunk, while the blacks are having sex, while the blacks are partying, including our politicians. There is an entire disciplined machine, well-oiled machine that is practicing tactical maneuvers. On farms, sometimes we think that the issue of land is just about ownership of land. No, but it is also about training facilities. You cannot receive farms if they're training facilities. You cannot receive farms if there are arms that are stashed on these farms. And this is the militarization I'm talking about. While the average black person doesn't even know how to use a firearm, the average white child knows how to use a firearm. They know how to use more than one firearm. They know how to fire at a target. They know how to put fire downrange. They know how to use a scope. They know what a mil dot to a scope is. That is the militarization. Hence, now and again in South African society, you are seeing violent altercations. Just the other day, there were 6 white men that beat a woman and the husband up. That is the pent up stress of the training, of the indoctrination, of the psychology of war that is being inculcated into our civilian population that we think are like you and me. They are prepared for war. They have been trained for war. When they see you and me, when they see black people, they see enemy combatants that they must eliminate, that they've been taught that at some point have to be eliminated. And then finally, we have got the turning, the infiltration of our people by spies. That is one of the final legs of a military or war situation, is when you get infiltrated by enemy forces. When businessmen fly into Johannesburg and they're supposedly coming here for business, but behind them they are Mossad, CIA, MI6. Behind them they are BAS. They come into the country, they mix, they mingle, but they come in with a purpose, an intent. In most countries, everybody knows that the Jews, every Jewish person is a spy for Mossad. There are levels of the spies, but every citizen of Israel. Every Jewish person is considered a citizen of Israel. And their first nation, of course, the first nation of allegiance is Israel. And so at every level in their civilian capacity, they are part of the network of information that forms the secret system of Mossad. Because they do say that by deception, they show war. They live among us, they are our friends, we go to work with them, we work for their companies, but their allegiance is not to South Africa, but to their mother country. And that level of infiltration is an uncontested level of infiltration, because you can never infiltrate their society in the same way. This is how it is that Israel was able to have a nuclear weapon, because of people that were working in America, in the nuclear system of America, who were Jews, American Jews, but they were loyal to Israel first. Those people are known as CNMs. And then we then have the Katsa that we now know as the Mossad agent. But there are other levels, 3 or 4 levels before him, that includes normal people. Your girlfriend. And then finally, we've got the turning of our own people against us. Like the Art of War talks about how you need to turn the enemy agent or the enemy soldier into an asset. You now have people that went to the liberation struggle in South Africa saying that there is no white monopoly capital. Men and women who went with an ideology of knowing that they were fighting white subjugation, white domination, white economic, political, and physical domination, now speaking out and saying there is no white monopoly capital 22 years after independence. Yet the system of white monopoly took over 200 years, if not 400 years, to institute in South Africa. They would have you and me believe that the system has been dismantled overnight. That is infiltration of your own people who are now being turned against you. You have people like Julius Malema who used to speak vocally and unequivocally about white monopoly capital and the fact that it needed to be brought down, the fact that nationalization had to happen. But today, Julius Malema is more concerned about Indians and the Guptas. He is now driving the PR, the propaganda machine and the propaganda message that has been built by the British and the BBC for them. That is a man who used to be our man who has been turned. That is basic art of war, turning agents of the enemy into your own assets. We've got politicians that have been turned. The basic black middle class of South Africa that is fed on white media propaganda is also co-opted in the same way. They are the people that institute the systems and processes that continue to make sure that white monopoly continues. To a certain extent, the fact that Gaddafi had 2 African leaders that voted for a resolution that got him removed means that even our own leaders have been turned to become enemies. For when you turn against a nation and allow it to be attacked, yet that nation is your brain, it's like you allowing somebody to put a spear through your brain and expecting to live tomorrow. So we are at war, ladies and gentlemen. Black people are too caught up in the mundane, too unread, too unstudied, too illiterate to understand that we are at war. And those that have the doctorates, those that have the master's degrees, those that are the most educated among us are the most indoctrinated. Those are the worst enemy agents that have been turned by their education, which is Western and Eurocentric. A lot of people have said that economists are going to be the way out of the situation that Africa is in. We've had economists since the independence of the first African country in 1957, and there has been no change. Because economics is the study of scarce resources and their distribution. Till today, resources continue to be owned by the West and continue to be distributed by the West for their own profit and for their own betterment. As long as an African is studying that art of taking very abundant African resources, making them scarce and putting them in the control of Westerners, we will never win. this economic war, and this what is a physical war. Right now, the United States is busy building the biggest embassy in Africa, in Zimbabwe. $200 million. Why do you think they need such an embassy in a country that they say is a failed state? What is that embassy for? And then, when you read the United Kingdom government documents on South Africa's strategic place in providing minerals, in providing rare earths that are for their strategic defense systems and defense machinery, you will understand why South Africa is at war. You will understand why the heart is under attack. And you will understand that this is a war that will never stop until the heart stops functioning. It's time that we wake up to these realities. Stop assuming that there's conspiracy theories and start getting informed. And start getting organized. All the things that I told you that are happening now need to start happening in the black psyche from our leaders who half the time are the most unconscious. We need to start planning. We need to start counter-propaganda. We need to start countering this economic sabotage because we have the power of policy making in our hands to change some of the economic sabotage that's happening on the continent. We need to change this biological warfare. We cannot allow our food and seeds that feed our masses to be controlled by foreign nations. It is counterintuitive that a nation would have its seeds, its staple foods, owned by foreign companies in the name of free markets. Yet the United States government has created these companies, have created these agro-businesses to colonize the world and to dominate the world with their seeds. We need to change this arms race situation. You cannot be arming what you think are citizens, but people who hate you, who've always hated you, who have hated you since the time of history. You can't arm them more than you have armed your own people. You cannot have a situation where African countries like South Africa, the richest country on resources, does not have call up and military training for any person that has finished their matric. Militarization. You cannot continue to have a nation that has foreigners employing private armies, foreigners controlling the security system and the private security in a nation. Infiltration. You cannot continue to have your own citizens who hold passports to your nation, also serving the armies of foreign nations, serving the intelligence systems, intelligence services of foreign nations. You cannot have your own people being turned against you for money. Black people in Africa, black South Africans, black Zimbabweans, black Africans in general, you've got to start being driven by ideology and not money. You have to stand for something for the benefit of your children. You've got to stand for something more than material benefit. The same way the Israelis stand by their nation irrespective. The same way Americans stand by their own nation. Young Americans are sent to die for peanuts for the purpose of their country to continue to maintain its imperial domination. You're at war, Africa. You're at war, South Africa. And you, South Africa, as the heart, are a greater concern to us. Boko Haram is already wreaking havoc like a tuberculosis in our lungs in Nigeria. But you, South Africa, are more important as the heart. We need to save you. Start to understand that you're at war and do what needs to be done to defend yourself.